Jonathan Moore. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics. I'm only an aspiring cartoonist. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome these most distinguished gentlemen. I'm just briefly going to introduce them, moving from my left to right. Jules Pfeiffer of the Field Syndicate, Paul Zepp of the Boston Globe, Doug Marlette of the Charlotte Observer, Tony Auth of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Jeff McNally of the Richmond News Leader. Tonight's affair is entitled In Cold Ink, Cartoonists Look at Campaign 80. The idea is that we will try to evoke from these gentlemen tonight, after having supper with them. I'm somewhat reluctant to call them gentlemen. Evoke from them some comments on both the subject matter of their work and a little on their craft, too. We are especially happy to have them here tonight for three reasons. One, all political scientists know that politics is a matter of art, not of science. Secondly, the dialogue up here in the Kennedy School Public Affairs Forum over the last 12 months has gotten a little dull, a little boring. We're a little tired by it all, so we're looking for some new insights and some fresh notions about the campaign, whether it is intellectual or visceral. And then finally, we want some humor and some wit. We want some fun for a change. And we will try to see if it's true that these people are so shy that they can only draw, that they can't talk. We thought we'd avoid going around the table and ask for initial presentations by each of our guests. On the other hand, we wanted you to get a little bit of a feel for them and maybe some targets to shoot at, some ideas stimulated before we went to questions and answers, which we will do. So we thought we'd try out a couple of questions around the table, asking anybody to comment who wanted to, and I will try to get the dialogue started. I should add one other thing at the outset. Doug Marlette, on my left, who is a Nieman Fellow this year at Harvard, is the originator of this idea and has gotten, has inveigled his friends and colleagues to come and appear with him tonight. I asked them all, trying to get a line on how we might proceed tonight, why they'd come, and two of them said they came because Doug had asked them to, and the other two said that they came because Doug had asked them to. The first two were smiling, and the second two were snarling. So whenever a question comes up, either asked by the moderator or asked by the audience that no one answers, Marlette is obliged to answer the question. First of all, let's start with the question of what is the purpose of political cartoons? And how do you see your role in influencing the outcome of Campaign 80? Who wants a shot?
Marlette.
Doug, it's coming up to you.
I think the purpose of editorial cartoons is answered in the question is to influence the outcome of the election in 1980.
Sounds like a term paper.
Yes, Doug?
No, I think cartoons are... Bill Malden once said that the role of a cartoonist is to play the gadfly, the lowly gadfly, circle and stab, circle and stab. And I think that's a good way of putting it. Cartoons are different from editorials. Editorials
Cartoons are serious.
Cartoons are serious. Editorials. Well, I'll let Jules take this over. Cartoons can't say, on the other hand, which is probably their strength and the thing that makes editorial writers and editors extremely scary about using cartoons. Does anybody else have
Well,
anything?
the question of whether you're going to influence an election or not, that Tony and I were on a TV show not too long ago, and the guy asked us, how do you deal with all this massive power that you have, you know? And you really don't start out the day trying to decide how you're going to distribute this massive power, or how you're going to, you know, one man is going to influence an entire election. I think it's kind of impossible. It's a very personal sort of art form, I guess. You're really just expressing an opinion, and it's your own opinion if you're lucky, like I think we all are. It's really as simple as that. It's a personal statement more than anything else. There isn't any conniving on the part of cartoonists to take over the world quite yet.
Well, cartoonists as a group, as I know them, boast most about their impotence, which puts them, at this point, very close to the rest of American society. But I don't know anybody who I've ever met who thinks he has ever influenced anybody or done very much of anything other than what Jeff's just said, is getting out their personal shot, hoping it's red, and in many ways also, and this is possibly of prime importance, giving comfort to those people who agree with you.
Yeah. It's a device that's marvelous for making one point at a time. And in terms of power, I think really it's just one more particle in what's a torrent of advice, criticism, propaganda, public relations, and you know, God only knows whether or not you've ever made anybody think twice about something. I think that's what we would hope for.
Well, I like to, I don't want to have this thing slip by, but I like to take issue with something that Jonathan Moore said in Newsweek this past week that probably, I can probably answer in my mind.
This addresses question number 7 on the list of questions.
Jonathan Moore said, in effect, that cartoons that cross the line from gloriously insulting to dangerously destructive. He said, I despair sometimes at the tendency to keep harping on this sense of inadequacy and incompetence in our political leaders. I think that's precisely what we're supposed to do. I don't think, I think we've had very incompetent leaders, and I think it's precisely that we should be addressing ourselves to. Cartoonists didn't give you Watergate, they didn't give you Vietnam, they didn't give you inertia as far as an energy bill, and I think these people have, we give them a whole lot of power, we pay their salaries. In some cases, we give them a house, and I think we should do just that. We should cross over the line and give them a good, just let them know we're there. And I think that's the role of a cartoonist, to be outrageous, to be sacrilegious, and to keep these people who are incompetent. Just try to let them know that we know that they're incompetent.
Well, that's the thing. I think you have to realize that it's a negative form of expression. It's impossible to say anything.
Disagree completely.
You can't say anything nice. It's impossible.
No, it's critical, but very positive, as opposed to
Yeah,
negative.
but would any of you...
Well, yeah, okay.
Yeah, quibble.
I'm not good in words. I can only draw.
Would any of you, are any of you capable of recognizing competence in a political leader? And if you did, would you give them any ink?
I wouldn't know what the hell it looked like if
Yeah. We've had precious little experience with it.
Yeah. We could go to children's books.
I think the question that Jonathan is raising is that cartoons are a critical art form. I think it's very difficult to cartooning and boosterism, just sort of like cognac and liver mush, don't mix. It's hard to do. The great cartoonists in the past have been people like Daumier, who was thrown in the slammer, and Thomas Nast was offered $500,000 to study art in Europe by William Marcy Tweed, and Art Young was tried for sedition. And these guys were not cheerleaders for the Chamber of Commerce. You know, there's a kind of there's an implicit critical position. But what Tony's trying to say, I think, if you want, is that by negating or by criticizing or voicing some opinion that is in tension with the powers, that is not necessarily critical. When you're negating something, you're positing something else. And I think that's really healthy, and then particularly in our culture, it's sort of the essence of the First Amendment.
Well, it's interesting when Doug talks about this tradition. He has to end with Art Young, who got indicted for sedition, because one of the things that must be pointed out is that this tradition pretty effectively ended at the time of World War I, and there were virtually no interesting, strong, opinionated, visceral cartoonists on the scene, with almost a single exception of Herb Bloch, until the period of Vietnam years, when this present generation came along. And in fact, what we're talking about in political cartoons tonight simply didn't exist in the 50s, when I doubt if you took a poll of most political cartoonists in the country, you could find anybody who supported or even heard of the First Amendment. And that most cartoonists, except for a small handful, were establishment hacks, and
Still are.
and thought that way, and drew that way, and believed that way, and you give them a handout and they do a cartoon. And it wasn't until Vietnam outraged a whole new generation of young men and a few women who were in the colleges that suddenly the viscera responded, and these guys who might have gone into other fields, and they're all on this panel, and there were a few others around in the country who were just wonderful, found what had been lost since the days of prior to the First World War, and started attacking from the gut, attacking with passion. I mean, there had been no passion in the work for years. And what distresses me about Jonathan Moore's Newsweek comment is just when the work is getting good again, there's an attempt to make it responsible. There's an attempt the death of interesting comment is responsibility. James Reston is a responsible columnist. He's also the man who invented the new Nixon. Responsibility is a plague, and particularly for cartoonists, and they shouldn't have anything to do with it.
Actually, I think in fairness to other cartoonists, I mean, the people on this panel probably do have are able to have a good deal of freedom in doing their work, and I think we're probably very lucky in that sense. A lot of the cartoonists don't have that kind of leeway, and that's really unfortunate. And I think to put that in a better perspective, in 1972, when we probably had one of the really great assaults on the First Amendment, you had over 600 newspapers endorsing the Nixon administration, publishers. That really curtails somewhat a cartoonist's ability to be animated and express himself. And as I say, we're very lucky here because we do have that kind of freedom on our papers, and that's in deference to, I say that in deference to our papers. That's not typical. And that's outrageous. That's really outrageous.
Do any of you ever, given this glorious abandon to caricature and to insult and to ridicule, do any of you have any feelings about restraining yourselves? Have you ever been censored by an editor, or do you ever censor yourselves? Or to put it differently, was there ever a really great idea you thought of, a great opportunity you were confronted with that you didn't feel you could turn into a cartoon, which you would feel was adequately responsible?
Well, I confess, every once in a while I come up with an idea that I think would be really great, but then as a father, I kind of say, gee, what if that guy's little daughter happens to see that, So every once in a while, I really do. I seriously do have a problem, and it's a flaw in a cartoonist. I'm afraid not to want to go in, go
Well-
for the neck, and
Those of us without children aren't plagued.
that's right. You're not plagued with compassion. And
When Billy Graham advocated that all rapists should be castrated,
There was a
I
great...
came up with a fabulous idea, which was not printed in your family newspaper, I must admit. But
oh, tell them about it.
Tell the idea about it.
The guillotine.
well, it was a religious cartoon. It was well, it was an incredible thing. The cartoon was Billy Graham dragging a reluctant black man up to a guillotine with a hole in it about big. And it's about 20 reasons I can think of why it didn't run. And I was just trying to keep my editor loose. But if the question is, are there any subjects that can't be touched? The answer is no. But there is some sort of relationship between the ring of truth and the way you deal with a subject that seems to be implicit in whether or not what you've done is successful and worth doing. I did several drawings about the controversy around Karen Ann Quinlan, and the word cartoon doesn't seem appropriate because that was such an incredibly painful thing, and she was, they were not funny cartoons, but there just aren't taboo subjects.
Well, I think that raises the whole question of taste is something you learn to edit yourself. Obviously, I think when I first started doing this job, I was very young. I tended to be somewhat shrill, and you learn to mellow over the years.
Yeah, he's gotten over it.
Meat cleaver Zed.
But obviously, there are some things that it's a matter of conditioning with your editor that he sees as being. They are very paternal, newspapers, and it's always amazed me how paternal they are. I mean, they're the ones who say you can't have certain words in the paper, like we've never heard those words before. But I think a cartoonist probably becomes his own best editor, and as I said earlier, depending on the kind of credibility and respect you have at the paper, I probably lose one cartoon a year, and it's never because of policy difference. It's always a matter of taste, and that's a very subjective thing. And it comes down to Tom Winship, who's my boss, and myself, and we hassle these things out. And if he kills the cartoon, I usually quit for 3 days and play a little golf.
One way of dealing with that is whenever I think of something that I know that I'm going to have difficulty with my editor, I'm going to know it's going to be a struggle, it's going to be a fight, then I think of something else that's even more outrageous, or maybe 2 or 3 things, and I take them to him, and he is repulsed by them, and I say, oh, well, okay, if you don't want to do that, what about this one? I show him the original idea, and he says, oh, okay, that's much better. You have to learn how to work your editor.
Who during the campaign of 80, and we'll take the primaries as well as the general election campaign, is your most favorite subject? And have any of you ever had the experience that your most favorite subject as a cartoonist was also the person whom you favored to put into office by, say, your own vote?
Well, that's a completely different. Usually, it's a terrible dilemma to go into the polling booth for me, because a lot of times the guy that you're choosing between 2 things: the guy who's going to be best for your industry and the guy who's going to be best for the country, and they're 2 separate people. And
What's good for cartooning is
a lot of pushing and shoving there mentally.
What about? I'm probably the one person in Philadelphia who's worse off because Frank Rizzo is no longer mayor.
That's right. My favorite candidate for presidency was John Connolly, who got, I think, 1 delegate after spending $9 billion. And John Connolly would have been just wonderful. I have 2 kids, too, who have to live in this country and don't have the... so obviously he was not... That's a conflict that you have as a cartoonist.
But did you want Connolly in the presidency so you could continue to do cartoons?
No, I'm
on him, or because
I'm being
you really...
facetious as a cartoon subject. He was the ultimate. or
And his
the
kids
sort of-
drink milk.
That's right.
I would do almost anything to get Richard Nixon. I have such Watergate hunger, I can't say.
Do you guys... What happens to you guys when governing begins and campaigning ends? Do you...
When does that happen?
You ever... Jules, do you ever think about doing a campaign about a complex issue? Do you ever try to provide any insights to what the country's facing in terms of government, or you just go on caricaturing for the 4 years in between campaigns as well as during the campaigns?
Let's leave.
Paul Zepp has got me started. I got to keep moving now.
You know, Jonathan, from this and your Newsweek comment, I think you have a profound lack of information about what the cartoonists do. That first of all, we are not in the insult business, and I don't think that anybody's seriously concerned about mocking or making fun. What all of us do, or all of us who are any good, try to do, and we have varying degrees of success, and we fail from time to time just like anyone else, but we all try to figure out what the issues are about and reduce those issues to the space of the cartoon that's given to us in our newspapers, and say as much within that space about complicated issues to decomplicate them, because very often one finds that what seems to be complicated is just so much cover story and hogwash, and to cut through it and demystify it for the audience, demystify it for the reader. And it seems to me that is an important function, not to take the issues that are often raised by government or by other politicians or by State Departments or whatever, and accept them at face value, as too often the press does.
That's why I love Pfeiffer, so verbal. I wish I could have said that.
Me too.
You know, I think there's a relationship between youth and the ability to appreciate what you're talking about. It's amazing. Whenever we get on television shows, all of these supposedly learned commentators want to talk about is, who do you like to draw? How do you draw Ford? Was he hard to draw? What about Nixon? You know, it's like if Kurt Vonnegut, not that there's any comparison, but they wouldn't ask him what kind of typewriter he used, which keys did he like to press, you know? And I'm a little afraid. I was on Issues and Answers about 3 weeks ago, and I think I got a little overboard on trying to upgrade the level of discussion. I think I came across as something of a prig, but nevertheless took the risk.
Well, there's a little frustration sometimes I find in cartooning. There's a limit to what you can handle, and there'll be an obscure bill running through some obscure committee in the House that all of a sudden I get excited about. You know, a banjo bill or something. You know, something important to me. Well, I think it's important to the rest of the country, and I'd love to be able to tell them about it. But sometimes it's just impossible to do that much educating in a cartoon. In other words, say, okay, today, gang, I'm talking about this bill, and this is what happened in it. This is what I think about it, and this is what you should do. You know, there's some things that really you have to leave to the editorial writers, unfortunately, and wait until it becomes a more visible issue that you can get your teeth into. And that gets frustrating sometimes.
I think that cartoons are interested in dealing with essences. That another way of putting what Jules was talking about is that editorial writers deal with facts. Newspapers deal with facts. Cartoonists are interested in what's really going on here and what's the truth of the matter here, and try to get at that with cartoons. As you know, as we all know, that some, in terms of like an art piece of art, or the Vietnam War, we got for years we got facts, but we didn't really understand what was going on, what was the truth. And I think the cartoonists are interested in the essences And that's something that's very frustrating for editors, editorial writers, because they're limited to juggling that. And cartoonists have the kind of opportunity to go for what they think's really going on.
What would each of you like to do most if you weren't an editorial cartoonist?
Be a fireman.
A farmer?
Fireman.
A fireman. Jules? A psychiatrist.
No, I was thinking of taking a crack at writing plays and movies.
Paul?
Well, I'm a failed hockey player. I guess I
Go back to...
sort of take power skating and try another whack at it.
Be a rock and roll star.
I'd want to run an institute like this one.
I would be in the salvage and junk business. Really. Or a boat yard. One of those.
We were talking earlier at supper, and the question came up about whether one could generalize about the ideology of editorial cartoonists, political cartoonists. Are they, for instance, more liberal or more conservative? Any comment on that?
Then who?
And each other.
Well, I think it's undoubtedly the case that 90% of the political cartoonists in this country, like 90% of the press, are extremely conservative. And it's unusual. Jeff is relatively conservative, and he's made a big splash because of that. And it's a wonderful thing. I didn't think it was possible for somebody who was a conservative to be a political cartoonist and be a good one for a long time, because I assumed that there would be a sort of Babbitt-like mentality.
You have to be an establishment hack. It's the only way.
I think that's because Jeff is not ideological. I think
That's
one of the things that makes good cartoonists are people who are not. I think that we all share that we're not ideologues. I think we're interested in other things.
Actually, I think the whole
I'd love to be an ideologue if I could find an ideology. I'm a frustrated ideologue. But I think without being ideologues, one has to work out of a passion which is concerned directly with the political process. In other words, you have to have views and strong views on what you think is right and what you think is wrong, and work out of that judgment. Without those definitions very clearly in your mind, and without trying to refine them and improve upon them, I think it's virtually impossible to do interesting work. And I think that bland period of cartooning we had for so long in this country up until recently was because cartoonists, most of them, simply didn't think about anything, had no interest. They were just filling that space.
And now we're in a period where there is a lot of work that's being done that is funny, but doesn't make any sort of serious point.
Yeah, it's kind of moving the gag cartoon up to the editorial page, and some of them are very funny. But as you say, there's often not a point.
I think when you do this every day, you develop attitudes as to what's right and what's wrong. That's your job, is to seek out things that are where there's blatant inequities or things that are ridiculous. And you do develop attitudes, but they're not along ideologue. You're not an ideologue, and I think it'd be wrong to be that predictable. But as Jules says, you should have a passion for what is right and what's wrong, or where there's injustice or where there's blatant abuse. And if you don't have that kind of passion, I think it's indicative in the kind of product that you produce every day.
And also there's a kind of dimension and insight that a cartoonist, if he's really good, can bring to something that one doesn't see in the columns, or one doesn't read in editorials. And I'm thinking in particular, I was talking about this to Jeff earlier, of a recent and brilliant Mike Peters cartoon, which is 3 panels. And the first panel is George Washington, and he says, "I cannot tell a lie." And the second panel is Richard Nixon, and he says, "I cannot tell the truth." And the third panel is Jimmy Carter, and he says, "I cannot tell the difference." Now, no one has done a better essay on Jimmy Carter's mind than that. I mean, that is perfect. It is simply perfect. And, and beyond the ken of David Broder and Joseph Kraft.
Then some of you are saying that editorial cartoonists are predominantly conservative, the people on my right, and the people on my left are saying that there are no ideologues among political cartoonists, which is right. I mean,
well, they generally reflect the attitudes of the publishers of this country, and I would say that it's sort of there's a mediocrity is the way I would describe it. But what you find, the reason people generally think that cartoonists are liberal is because the better ones tend to have, and using that word very loosely, have an attitude that is in tension with the powers that be, with the principalities, with the status quo. That good cartoons have good cartoonists are critical. They're not satisfied with the way things are, and so the better cartoonists are going to be critical, are going to be in tension with things. But that's why those cartoonists are the ones you see. They're the ones who are syndicated, and because they're good cartoons. It's very hard to do good cartoons saying 3 cheers for the status quo. It's hard to do positive, boosterizing cartoons.
is the industry getting a little crowded, or are there too many of you guys now? Are you pushing each other around?
Too many young guys.
Yeah. Young talent.
Trying to discourage young talent whenever possible.
Is Gary Trudeau a political cartoonist?
Of course.
Jules?
Well, I think John Anderson certainly thinks so, and John Connolly certainly thought so. Yeah, I mean that Doonesbury is read very carefully in Washington and elsewhere, and politicians think he is. So we better accept that. Newsweek didn't think so; he wasn't mentioned in their story. But I guess I'm not either because they didn't mention me either.
Would you people think it was degrading if your cartoons were run on the comic strip pages, or do you want to be on the editorial pages where that much contrast, as you were describing before, can exist between what you do and what the editorial writers do?
It's good for business to be on the editorial page because nobody reads editorial pages. They do look at cartoons. I'm not on the editorial page. My cartoons were moved over about a year or so after I came to the Charlotte Observer. My cartoons were moved to the op-ed page to put distance between the masthead of the newspaper and my cartoons. So I can't speak for those on the editorial page. So.
I'd rather be on the sports pages. It is a
Wider issue.
Before, or as the audience gets ready to ask questions, and I might point out that there are mics to the left and to the right on the floor, and mics in the middle of the 2 balconies. And if you don't want to go up to a mic, just put up your hand and speak loud, and we'll take your question right from the floor. You can direct it to the panel as a whole or to an individual member on the panel. And while the audience is getting ready for that, are there any questions which either of you would like to ask each other, or any questions which you think are appropriate to pose to the panel as a whole before we go to the audience?
How do you guys get your ideas?
Doug, I've wondered if there's a parallel between Thomas Nast having the $50,000 offer or whatever it was to study art abroad and you coming to Harvard. And whether that was arranged by your publisher or not.
Okay, question from the audience? Yes.
First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, but speak up so the other people can hear you.
Some of the issues in the campaign are complex, and I noticed a trend in the past of the press. On the one hand, to make complex issues into simple abstractions, and on the other hand, not to do research on what the issues are. For instance, for each stage there's a count on how much mud is slung, but not on whether it's natural or artificial ingredients in mud. Do you ever go to sleep at night, this is for all of you, do you ever go to sleep at night worrying about whether you're betting the process of reducing
Well, I couldn't care less about the campaign or the two turkeys running. No, I go to sleep at night worrying about the new arms race. I go to sleep at night worrying about why we're suddenly in a debate that we were in the 1950s and again in the 1960s, and somehow we're always defenseless against the Russians. And why, with the incredible might that we have, we still buy that story, and it's still easy to sell to the public and sell to the press and sell through the press. That's what I worry about.
Actually, it bothers me that a lot of the campaign is really geared for the 6 o'clock news. And the same guy who asked the questions out in the audience from a particular network asks it at the next stop because he knows that that's going to guarantee him time on television. And it also guarantees the administration or Reagan or Anderson that it's not going to be an abrasive question. They're really the kinds of questions that, as Jules said, really do have some kind of an impact, really aren't debated or resolved in these campaigns. I mean, I don't know.
Or in many cases brought up at all.
For presidential candidates to be talking about abortion as an issue, that's an issue and they deal with it from a one-dimensional aspect. Nobody talks about the fetus when it comes to term or how they're going to cut welfare benefits that's going to affect that live fetus that has gone to term. They're all talking about issues that are alarmist issues and that they know will polarize people. And a lot of these people, a lot of these candidates get constituents as one issue. They become one issue candidates. I think there's been very little done in talking. How is Ronald Reagan going to reduce inflation? I'd like to know how he's going to do that. I mean, I don't think Jimmy Carter can do that either.
Tony?
I suspect that we are a lot more like average citizens in terms of our response to the campaigns than you would suspect. If I were not doing what I'm doing on a newspaper, I would not be in journalism. I would be doing children's books or medical illustration or something else. And my response is, I think, against the grain. I'm always watching not to be sucked in and to raise the questions that you're talking about.
Right. I think cartoons deal with those issues more than the candidates do. I think the good cartoonists deal with those issues regularly. And if you're concerned about manipulation of symbols, it's ironic that the area where symbols are openly used and manipulated, that's one of the few places where you can find issues being dealt with.
Also, there's another problem which I run across when I'm trying to figure out what's going on in these campaigns, and that is, consider the national campaign, the poor clown that has to step on the bus every day, follow his candidate all around every single day. He hears the speech over and over again. The people that are listening in Dubuque or hearing the speech by the candidate, which is basically the same old stuff, it's new to him. It's not new to the guy. After about 2 days, the poor slob on the bus is kind of saying, well, nothing new again today. No new issues are being raised. And everybody goes to sleep. And the only news that comes out is if he stumbles over the speech or if somebody throws something at him, or something like that. And it really, very quickly in a national campaign, you lose the discussion completely because the guys that are covering it kind of say, oh my God, the same old speech, nothing new, everybody was bored, And it's basically because they're sitting around and everybody's bored because they've heard the same speech over and over again. But the people who are there in the audience, a lot of times it's a new thing for them. So a lot of times I am getting information from a very bored and terribly dull press, and it's not conducive to really sitting down and intellectualizing on the issues at all.
I think the campaigns are far too long. They do very little. I don't think they're very meaningful at all. They become counterproductive. And as Jeff says, it's the guffaw or the screw-ups that get the headlines, and there's very little in-depth discussion. Why isn't there a great in-depth debate on some of the major issues? Why don't the three guys get up and say what they would do with inflation? Why don't they all duck it, I think it's ridiculous.
I think also that it reflects the times. There's sort of a school of cartoons that was mentioned earlier that is kind of gag cartoons using political figures as the characters. And I think this is a reflection of this time. I think we live in a time when people don't want to think about the arms race. They don't want to think about famine. They want to feel good. It's the narcissism of this age. People want to feel good, and the cartoons that you're referring to are sort of a kind of the. It's as if all these cartoons were born in Southern California. They all it's the transcendental meditation and the est and of editorial cartoons. People want to laugh. They don't want to deal with the issues, and there are a lot of cartoons who will feed that. But that's I think this is just the time. We live in this strange time, a demented time.
And I think part of that is that people no longer believe that issues are dealable with, that what's come out of Vietnam and Watergate and the collapse of the civil rights movement is a sense that the problems resurface as soon as they've been dealt with. And they come back in other forms, and they come back as serious and grim as awful as always. And they're awful, and people now, including the President of the United States, don't believe that you can solve problems. This, like everything else in our history, is a fad. We're a fad-oriented culture, and we'll get over that, and there'll be a period of hope again. But right now, we're entered into a long period of decline, underlined by what I find to be a very serious despair, and the surface part of that despair is the narcissism that Doug is talking about. It comes out in lifestyles, but I think it all has to do with not believing that anything works. So at least I'm going to have a good time, and I'm not going to think about anything.
There's also when Joe McGinnis published The Selling of the President in 1968, it was considered an expose. And now all the candidates are bragging about who are packaging them.
That's right.
And why and Reagan is not being allowed to talk what he really thinks, so he's going to read his speech. It's just incredible. I mean, that book would probably not be published today because it's no longer news.
That's right. For the first time, we got a president of the United States who actually, his aides or Jody Powell, whoever it is, will actually have a press conference and discuss the image of the president as if it's another thing. And I say, well, we're dressing it up. This week's going to look a lot better. They're talking about a different thing, and it's absurd. They're taking it. It's all very serious. Nobody laughs anymore when people like that come out and say things like that. Seriously.
But what's awful also is that the press buys it. When Jimmy Carter announces after the raid that Iran is no longer a problem,
Right.
the story dropped off the pages.
It was hilarious.
I think it's interesting that we spent a year and a half absolutely fixed on a presidential race, and yet the interest groups control the Congress, and that's where the legislation comes out of. And yet probably most people don't know who the congressman is, or really don't scrutinize him when he runs for re-election, don't know what interest groups have bought him off over the past 2 years.
Mine's
And
in
that's
jail.
that's where the real...
Ozzie Myers.
Oh, stop boasting.
Question back there.
Is that Chip Carter? Is your name Chip Carter?
Well, no, I'm against cynicism. I'm also against voting. So, I think the best thing that could happen is if nobody showed up to vote on election day. It might deliver a message.
Any
Yeah, well, so's your old man.
Yes.
kind of revoked, all right? And when you look at a lot of these, you know, I'm partial to that because I read the Boston Globe a lot. And the thing is, what emotion are you trying to evoke? Just fear and insecurity, or something else?
That would at least be something.
They're good.
Paul,
Does he want an answer to that?
are you trying to evoke any other emotion other than fear and insecurity?
I think a cartoon is different things to different people. Some people, it reinforces people who agree with you. It points out things for someone who's straddling the fence. It provokes people who disagree with you. You know, it's satire. You poke fun at people who have tremendous power, and I think that's essentially, basically all it is. It's no more, no less.
Paul, you're talking about cartoons as if you could easily classify what a political cartoon is, and we do 5 a week. Some of them are angry, some of them are amused, some of them are bemused, some of them are lyrical. You know, I see a whole lot of emotion in the good political cartoons that I see. A much broader range than fear and anger, or fear and what was the other one? Insecurity.
But he's talking about the reaction from the reader, I assume. I mean, it's not a case of how we feel. Obviously,
Well, okay,
to
turn
get it up
around.
every day.
Tears, sorrow.
I think that a way, this may be a naive way of looking at cartoons, but is to get response, any response. You know, I'm not particularly interested in persuading people to think the way that I think, but if they respond in some way, I think the idea of a democracy is that the founding fathers had it. If enough people know what's going on, if they're thinking about the issues, then you know the hope, and this is probably naive, is that the majority of them will come up with the proper solutions to the issues.
That's right. At least you're getting them thinking about something, which I think gets back to the cynicism question. If you can at least excite, you know, stir up the coals a little and get people excited one way or the other. I mean, if they want to come and shoot me in my office, you know, or something like that, at least you're getting them, you know.
Yeah, I would in this particular age, I would be pleased to get any kind of response. If people felt despair, felt insecure, I would be thrilled, because I don't think people feel anything. I think just having somebody feel anything is a major accomplishment.
Other questions? Yes.
What's your favorite piece and why?
John?
Al?
Favorite piece?
Question.
You don't want to go into that?
Which is your favorite cartoon? And it doesn't have to be your own cartoon. It could be the cartoon of somebody else.
Doesn't have to be your own piece.
Right. Jeff, you're up.
I really vary from day to day, and it's a problem because I'll do a cartoon in the morning. I'm one of these people that it's impossible for me to bounce my work off of somebody else and say, what do you think of this? I just don't want to hear it. If they say it's crappy, I won't respect them anymore, and I won't ask their opinion. So I really avoid all that, and and as a result, I'll have a favorite cartoon of mine, and it'll be for a completely different reason. People won't understand it, or they won't like it, and then one I'll do at 10 minutes of 9, and about 20 minutes I won't be all that proud of, but I figure tomorrow's another day, and the phone rings off the hook. It says it's the greatest piece of work you've done in a long time, you know. And so it's hard for me. I like cartoons. Sometimes I just like them because I like the drawing of the general store or the pickup truck that I did or something like that. But there have been, and a lot of times the readers will turn, they'll kind of sway my vote a little. If I get a lot of response on a cartoon that I didn't think was all that great, I say, well, maybe, there might have been something to that. So there are a bunch of cartoons that, that I really like personally, but it has nothing to do with whether it's a good cartoon or not. It really is. So I think I've successfully killed that question.
But have you killed it for the whole panel?
Oh, I trust.
Well, I like, it's really difficult for me to relate to my own work like that. I like work by people who are obviously really turned on. And somebody used the word cynical. I think that the best cartoonists are extremely skeptical. But if they were cynical, they couldn't do it. And there's some degree of maybe naive hope expressed in even the most savage cartoon. But I like people like Sorrell and Pat Oliphant and, of course, Jules and Conrad, who influenced me when I was in high school and college. Tommy Ungerer, who does mostly children's books, but when he does political stuff, it's really incredible and wonderful.
I like cartoons that if I think of something that, if it's an issue that I really care about, if I think of an idea that says exactly what I want to say, and if it can be funny on top of it, and if I know that nobody else would have thought of it, I can hardly draw it. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I like to look at a cartoon and say, geez, I wish I'd done that. But it has to be, my favorite cartoons are ones that are biting. I like good satire, but I also appreciate really good draftsmanship, and aesthetically, it works. And if there's humor, that adds another dimension. There's different, it's very hard to say, well, this cartoon is my favorite cartoon, because I think we all think in terms of a batting average. How many did you hit on this week? Were you 1 for 4? Were you 2 for 4? Are you none for 8? And it's a case of maintaining a consistency where there's something in it every day. And if you really hit on it and really get one that combines humor and draftsmanship and makes a really good statement, then I think you've done something. But that's such a rare bird, and it's hard to do that every day. So it's just hard to be consistent.
Well, these guys here are 4 of the best we have in this country, and as I said before, there was a time when you couldn't pick out 4. And in addition to them, there are maybe 4 or 5 others, Conrad and Levine and Sorrell and Oliphant and Peters. I mean, I get such joy seeing the kind of work, the strong work and brilliant work that's being done today, because I come out of a time when it was a desert here, and it feels wonderful to see this kind of energy and opinion and at times very appropriate savagery, so that it's not so much the individual cartoons, well, because those vary, but the sense of what's being done that I find so exciting. The sense of being part of a profession that for the first time in many years deserves respect. That's kind of wonderful.
Do you sometimes find yourself censoring yourself, writing to different regions of the country, whereas you just want to write for Untitled Observer, which is basically a southern paper?
What does that mean?
You write for, the Globe, which is, like, do you find yourself having kind of cut down a little bit?
I find myself at the Charlotte Observer able to do things that say the Boston Globe wouldn't print. I find myself with an extraordinary amount of freedom there. I don't think about the other papers that syndicate my work. I just think about what I'm working for the Charlotte Observer, but I have an extraordinary amount of freedom, and I think all of us do here. And so I really don't think about what would fly in Peoria, what would play.
I think there is a tendency to concern. I draw for the Boston Globe readership primarily, but I think in the back of that, I almost wish I wasn't syndicated, because I think there is I think you would do a different thing. You do think in the back of your mind, the paper in Waco, Texas. And, primarily it's the Globe, but it's almost like you do think of it as being whether this thing is going to, whether they'll print it. That's the problem. Most papers don't print it.
I feel like that I'm drawing for the Charlotte Observer, and the fact that these other papers are using it is because they saw something that was coming out of there, and that if they use it, then that's just gravy or icing, and I don't really sort of think about that. If I thought about that, it'd drive me crazy. There's about 1 million different perspectives out there.
I think about all the papers that print my work only once a month when the check arrives. Seriously, that's about it.
Well, I got syndicated initially by mistake. I used to have so much dialogue in my cartoons that the editors, thanks God, didn't read it and didn't realize until it was too late what I was doing. But I think basically you have to think in terms of your home paper, or maybe even beyond that. You think of, I know I work for 6 friends and myself, and everything grows out of that. And within that, one is always aware of an audience out there, but you have to be very careful not to become so aware of them that that self-censorship becomes a problem rather than a refinement.
I think we really missed the boat locally, though. That's for the. I mean, none of us probably do. I don't know how many.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I find I don't do any local cartoons except in a major catastrophe of some kind, like a local election. But the most of the readers regard the national political figures as showbiz personalities, people that are on TV. These are guys that aren't real, and their local politicians are real. I mean, they know who they are. They see them on the street, at least on the city council level and that kind of thing, the state legislature. And when, in that rare occasion when I do a local cartoon, the response is huge because of that. These are real people that I'm talking about. They're not just these cartoon characters that are in Washington. So it's too bad a lot of times that like Paul,
I think that's where the cartoon has any impact, if it
Yeah.
does. I mean, the guys really squirm. You get the guy on the phone and he calls you. That's really nice to know that you've really stuck it in and he feels it.
Why don't you do any local cartoons?
I do. I try to do at least one a week. But obviously, that's not, I don't even find that sufficient. I mean, I would like to have the option. If I didn't have alimony payments, I'd like to have the option of doing 4 a week on a given week. That's really, there's a great crisis in Boston right now with the whole school situation. I haven't even done anything on it. I think that's where a cartoonist really could have some impact, because you can really go after people, and there's a response to that. People can relate to that. They see the guy in the street with a hat over his face. That's great.
Yes.
I'd like to ask Mr. Pfeiffer, you said that in the 50s there really were no significant political cartoonists outside of Cuba. Would you not count Walt Kelly?
Oh, well, yes, actually, Kelly was absolutely brilliant, but he was not. He did the cartoons, except for a brief period, as a political cartoonist when he actually did the conventional form cartoon on a paper called the New York Star. And in doing that, went a long way to form my own sensibility about what a cartoon should be. He did his politics in Pogo, and I was really talking about the editorial page cartoons. No, Kelly was a great, and terribly important cartoonist. And the time when Al Cap went into retirement politically, and writing an article for Look or Life magazine saying he was marrying off Lil Abner because you couldn't make fun of anybody anymore and you couldn't do politics. And Kelly was going after Joe McCarthy with a savagery and wit that is still memorable. He was a truly great man.
Any questions on the balconies that I've missed? Yes.
Here I am.
There are actually, about 3 or 4 women now, and no?
I think there's only 2, isn't there?
Well, but I have a theory about that. I suspect most of us got started drawing and doing cartoons when we were about 5 or 6 years old, and I suspect that had I been a girl, I would have been shunted into fashion illustration. And I don't know if that would be true anymore or not.
I think that's changing now. You do have to have first of all, there aren't that many jobs. So there's less than, 150 jobs?
Something like that.
It requires a single-mindedness that I think women today have, given the changes in the 60s, and deservedly so. And I think you will see that sort of thing happening. But when we did it,
There are now 3 female cartoonists. One in Greenville, South Carolina, Kate Palmer, and then one at the Newsday in Long Island, and one at the...
It's a very difficult field to crack. I mean, regardless of there's a lot of Rotarians out there too who have jobs, and I don't think do a very good job, but even they have jobs that are secure, and it's frustrating to get someone who has a lot of talent come along and they come in to see you and you say, well, geez, that's super, you've got a great portfolio, but I don't know where I'm going to, I don't know what to suggest. And that could be, you could have a woman come along at the same time, and it wouldn't make any difference because there just aren't that many jobs.
But yeah, there aren't very many. There also, I was going to mention that there are two black cartoonists that I'm aware of. One is Chester Commodore at the Chicago Defender, and there's a black cartoonist, Ollie Harrington, that works for the Daily World,
yeah.
who is excellent. He's an excellent cartoonist.
There's also a woman in San Francisco who does really good work for the Black Panthers.
So
we feel
the
guilty
black
about
cartoonists work for black papers or the communist paper, the Daily World. It gives you some indication of what goes on.
I guess the question I have is more of Jonathan Moore's statement on the tenor of usually in the court's office. But the candidates were afraid to say anything because if they said the wrong word,
Yeah.
the wrong whatever, they perceived that the press was just waiting for one slip, and then they would be spread all over national publications. And it led to a campaign, literally, of increasing extractions and jargon and safe words. And I'm not blaming the media for that or the candidates, because I don't know where it started, but it sounds like a chicken and egg phenomenon. And as now a layperson in the field who watches in the media this go back and forth, how is that going to end? How is that cycle of Jimmy Carter being ever more careful because the press is getting ever more better at picking out ever less, as he said, and turning it back on him? It looks to me like an unending thing for you. Everyone's going to have to resign or no one will show up at the polls.
Well, but when was the last political campaign that you thought was informative, that was based on issues? I don't think it's just this press. Outside of George McGovern's campaign, which was on the issue of the war, and God knows at that time there couldn't have been a political campaign on any other issue, politicians tend for all time to steer away from issues. I mean, this is as true of Teddy Roosevelt running as it is for Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, because they don't. It's not only the press they don't want to disturb. They don't want to disturb any possible voter out there. I mean, the whole political process seems to be against politics.
There is also, though, undoubtedly the tendency of the press to cover it like a horse race. And that's because it's easiest to cover it that way.
Yes.
Who's ahead now? But the politicians are into that just as much as the press is. But I'm not going to defend the media.
Okay, it seems as if you all have, I think, quite properly stressed the extent to which your cartoons do ultimately look at one or another, shall we say, issue, which frankly, although that sounds like not a hell of an accomplishment, if one looks at the 6 o'clock news, it may in fact be so. There may be in fact a good treatment of issues, although in fact what I'm going to ask about is what do you think one can do about people's ability to ignore information and about the responsibility. I think that I missed it, but I think that there was a program here recently talking about what can be done to the political process to incorporate more dialogue, responsibility, and general information in political process, say campaigning or even just examination of what goes on day to day. I mean, there may be a war somewhere, but people's ability to care may have something to do with their understanding why this is happening, or I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just saying. No, I don't. I'll just close it here. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about Anderson as either a spoiler or a real person, real candidate, and I'm just wondering if anybody can say anything about their optimism as to the question as to whether or not information has to come from outside. And if it does, not that Anderson is all that outside, is it going to... Carter has ignored Anderson, and I think that's part of a process of ignoring what is outside. So if one can ignore what is outside, what is the hope of getting outside inside?
That away.
Ronald Reagan's
We've been
advanced
trying to
man.
challenge. We've been trying to challenge you panelists all night. Now you have your chance to star. Paul?
I think he's right.
I agree. I think he is good. I wouldn't touch that one.
That's the problem, all right.
Yes. Could you speak up, please?
Louder, please. I can't hear you. Can you speak louder, please?
Do they not perhaps lend legitimacy to what the rest of what's in the papers they appear in? And does anyone think that political cartoonists could make it in a paper primarily or consisting primarily or exclusively of political cartoons?
Sorry. You said could a paper exclusively made up of political cartoons?
Well, I would like to be able to buy a paper that has all of your people's cartoons in them and none of the other stuff.
Would you also pick up a paper that had the other stuff though while you bought the cartoons? That's the thing. See, I'm very concerned. A lot of people say, I turn to your cartoon the first thing in the newspaper. That's the first thing I look at. And I say, well, what's the second thing? And they say, well, I'm a real estate salesman, so I look at the classified ads and then the standings in the National League, and then I throw the whole thing away. And what you're dealing with basically is this creeping illiteracy. More and more people just want to look at the pictures and not have to bother their pea brains with reasoning or getting their own information. And I think the cartoon really has to go hand in hand with the hard information, the black and white educational process. I think you really have to know what we're talking about before you can bounce off our cartoons.
I delight in differing opinions, and sure, there's a lot of stuff in my paper that I say, well, that's just hogwash, and then I'll do a cartoon based on that attacks it or something. The only time I've really had trouble with editors was when I worked for an anti-war paper, and there you've got a case where your editor thinks he's got a copyright on the truth, and so you run into trouble. You can't attack his sacred cows. Whereas at least in the mass media, at least on the paper that I work for, there aren't any. So I'm better off, I think.
Yeah, I would hate to have to rely on television, and as Jeff says, you really need to be informed to understand the cartoons if they're good cartoons. To have a whole compilation of cartoons that's the format, I don't think you know what was going on because you'd have no source, and if you had to rely on television as your main source, you still would have no source.
That's the other thing. You got to watch when you're a cartoonist. If you did a cartoon that everybody would get, everybody would understand, it'd be terrible. It would, you don't want to get to the lowest common denominator. You have to assume a little intelligence on the part of your reader. I mean, and that gets back to the question of, assuming that they know something, that they're informed. And a lot of times it goes over the heads of the readers, but they're not people you're concerned with anyway.
Could I ask?
As far as lending legitimacy to a newspaper that you disagree with or disagrees with you politically, I find in my own case that I get most personal enjoyment by appearing in basically conservative papers because it gives me a chance to get at an audience that ordinarily wouldn't see my work and I wouldn't ordinarily have a shot at. Because it's no particular thrill to present myself to, say, the Village Voice audience, who will generally tend boringly to agree with what I say, and that's no fun, and it's no theater, and it's and you're not making any points that way. But what's happened in recent years is that cartoonists, for the first time, are starting to appear now and again in papers which disagree with them. Now that, in the 50s was simply, and before then, simply didn't happen. Didn't happen. The English have that tradition of papers, Tory papers running socialist cartoonists, but we had no tradition of running cartoonists with opposing views a liberal paper ran a liberal cartoonist, and a conservative paper ran a conservative cartoonist. And since there are no radical papers, there was no problem there. And and with the invention of the op-ed page, one begins to see more and more differing opinions creep in, and that's interesting.
What did you once say about an op-ed page, though, Jules?
I said that the op-ed page is the ghetto in which newspapers officially apologize to their readers for the existence of the First Amendment.
Could I ask a question about television? Doug alluded to this being the age of television. If editorial cartoons are one grand medium of politics, of campaigns, then television might be the other. What do you think, each of you, about what kind of a job television does on politics and campaigns, and what do you think of the characteristics and the impact of that particular medium?
I think television is the pits. I really do. It's contrived. It's brought down to the most common denominator. It's basically entertainment oriented, given the kinds of people who are the anchormen and it's basically showbiz. And I really do think we've become so television oriented in these campaigns, and it's gone on for a few years now, that I think it's really a big problem in terms of the kind of campaigns that are being run and the kind of news and issues that are coming out of these campaigns, or lack of.
I think what we ought to do is go back to we ought to do what the British do. That would be my first reform of television, and just call those guys news readers. That's what they do in England. They don't call them anchor men or any of that stuff. They're news readers. They get on. They're just some clown who reads nice. And the other thing, it's shocking if you transcribe Walter Cronkite's half hour on TV and all the other stuff that's in there in that half hour. If you transcribe that onto a front page of a newspaper, I've seen this done. And it comes out it's around half a page of the front page of the New York Times. And that's kind of shocking when you consider how much newspaper you read just over a donut, sitting around for 5 minutes. And I think television has a use here and there. It's probably good. Every once in a while, I confess I'll tune in the news every once in a while just to see what everybody else thinks is going on. So I'm a little in tune with my readers once in a while. But to rely on it as your primary source of information, which more and more people are doing, is just plain frightening, I think.
But I think you're overlooking the visual impact, which is terribly important in regard to television. And while it's as awful as everybody says, I think it also must be said that without TV, much of what galvanized the country in terms of the civil rights movement might not have happened. It would have taken a longer time happening. The same must be said about the war in Vietnam. That seeing pictures, movies of kids, black kids getting beaten up and dragged away from lunch counters, was far more graphic in telling what was going on racially in this country than stories in the New York Times, which gave greater detail. And that what's unfortunate in recent years is that we've become inundated with impact. It no longer has that kind of dramatic newness and freshness to us. And so the more negative factors of television have taken over from the positive visual ones that once were there. Whether that comes back again, or whether there's a form of television that can be more interesting, I don't know. But in terms of telling what the news is, I don't really find the newspapers much more informative than what one finds out in those half-hour network shows. Local news is terrible.
Well, the only thing I can add to that, I think, is that what you mentioned, the war and civil rights disturbances and riots, as well as fires and things like that, are things television can cover very well. As soon as you get the least bit abstract, you're in deep trouble.
Well, I think you're in deep trouble with the press, too, though.
Sure.
The press can't handle an idea.
Well, what do you call the press?
I mean, the newspapers.
Well, okay.
You're in deep trouble with a lot of the readers, too.
It's a full-time job trying to stay informed. I mean, it really is incredible. I read about, last time I counted, I subscribed to about 15 magazines And that, I don't read them all cover to cover, but where do you get your information from? Your 6 friends?
Yeah, those are the guys.
But Jules, how are we going to pass through this period of despair and cynicism and get more upbeat and more hopeful, as you said that we would in time, if we can't get any explanation of really serious issues which do face us, like the Vietnam War and like civil rights were, if we can't get it from either the cartoonists or from the print media or from television?
It's weird. It really has to do with a shift in time, in mood. It's something magical, because if one looks back at the myth of John F. Kennedy, one thinks of a spirit of freshness and vitality that was brought into the White House right after the Eisenhower years of blandness. But then if you make the mistake of watching again, because they've appeared on television in recent years, Kennedy being interviewed by Edward R. Murrow back then, you discover he was a hardline Cold Warrior like everyone else at the time, that he ran on a missile gap, that in fact he had nothing to say that was any more interesting than any other hack politician at that particular time. But he was more attractive, he was more articulate, he gave a sense of style, and he had wit once he was in the White House. He carefully hid it when he was running for office. And there was a charm and a movie star charisma that revitalized people somehow, that had nothing to do with the content of the man, that had nothing to do with his politics. So, and that kind of started things, or helped with the atmosphere of getting things moving again. What I'm saying is that these things can't ever be planned. They happen by accident. The accidents are always there, waiting to happen.
Maybe just a couple more questions, and then we'll close it off, sir.
By the nature of your profession, you're involved in an extensive and ongoing look at what goes on in the country. So what is your perception of the kinds of directions the country will be moving in over the next 4 or 5 years, perhaps over the next decade?
Ooh. I think we're going to have an era of I think probably Reagan will probably win, which is, we've talked about, probably fun for us, but not too much fun for the rest of the country. But I really think we're going to have an era of confrontation again. I think it's going to go back to the 60s. We have all kinds of different minority groups now who are going to want a piece of things. You're going to have the economics, the inflation is going to be much more severe and austere, and I think we're in for some hard times coming up.
Other comments on that question?
Well, I've always sort of thought that what we do is to chronicle what the inmates are up to, and I couldn't predict what they might do next.
I think everything's going to get fixed.
One last question.
Will be what? Oh, I can't imagine that happening. It's a funny thing, though, to talk to cartoonists from other countries. I know a guy from Brazil came through Richmond one time for some reason. I told him he'd taken a wrong turn on Interstate 95. He spent the afternoon with me, and I asked him about, he's a fairly famous guy, and I asked him about his career, and it was punctuated. He said, well, 3 years I worked for this paper, then I was in jail for 2 years. In 3 years I did this, and then I was in jail for about 3 months then, and his whole career is punctuated by jail terms, and this is something that, I doubt would ever happen in this country. Nobody would sit still for it, although we do kind of take it for granted.
Actually, I think one of the real dangers in this country, as far as the press, is I think it'll be a long way before it affects cartoonists. It usually hits investigative reporters first. But I think the whole notion of buying out corporations and conglomerates, buying up newspapers, is really one of the most dangerous things that's happening. Conceivably, you can have a foreign government buy the New York Times and do their own thing with the press. There's nothing to stop that, and I think we're becoming a country of less and less individual, independent newspapers, independent voices, and every time you lose a paper, that's a flow of information, an independent voice that's cut off, and I think that's really one of the most dangerous things down the road.
Are there any other final comments that anybody on the panel would like to make? Then I would like to share a confession with you and with the panelists that I didn't share with Newsweek magazine. I couldn't get through a political campaign without these guys. They get my blood up, they get my spirit up, they make me feel that after working as a bureaucrat in the government and after working in campaigns and after trying to study campaigns and politics here, there's still hope. So on that note, I'd like to close. I want to thank Mr. Marlette particularly for bringing this group together. We were all most pleased and most privileged that you took the time to join us tonight. Thank you all very much.